we've ended up talking about trans activism a lot on Dark Horse, and I've written about it a lot. And we have always been careful to distinguish it from what we call true trans, which is an exceedingly rare condition, which in a few cases may actually be genetic, such as in a little village in the Dominican Republic, and in a few cases may be due to developmental things that happened in utero, for instance, but it is exceedingly rare. And increasingly, this conversation, I'm certain, is not about those people, by and large, who want to stay out of the limelight and want to be left alone to live the lives that they need to live in order to be their best selves. The vast majority of what is passing for trans right now comprises this resurgence of regressive gender norms that will reinforce disempowering lifestyles for women. That's one. Social contagion, mental delusion, or some combination of all three. So let me just talk about these three briefly. With regard to regressive gender norms, if you're a man, you should feel free to be a sensitive poet who likes to dress in flowy clothes and discuss your feelings for hours over tea and scones or wine and ice cream or whatever it is you want to discuss it over, right? And do that. Be that guy. Do not mistake this for being a woman. It doesn't make you a woman. It makes you a guy who doesn't fit into traditional gender norms. That's fine. You're a guy. You're a man. If you're a woman, be free. Actually be free to be a risk-taking electrician, perhaps, who does not want to answer the question, how are you feeling today? Like ever, maybe. Don't mistake that for being a man. You're a woman who doesn't fit into traditional gender norms. And I've said this many, many times. When we were growing up in the 70s and 80s, that was increasingly fine. I was a girl and became a young woman who did not fit traditional gender norms. And I was lucky to have parents who thought that was just fine. And if I were growing up today, my desire to never wear dresses, and when I was put in a dress to get it pretty dirty because I was outside playing in the mud, would have resulted in someone, perhaps privately at school, informing me that probably what I was revealing was that I wasn't a girl at all, but that I was a boy. No, wrong. I never mistook myself for a boy. And I'm also not, as some number of people who are gender nonconforming are, homosexual. Just not, right? There are lots and lots of ways to be a girl or a boy, a woman or a man. And none of those different ways of being mean that what you are revealing is that you're actually the other thing. You're not, okay? You're not. So returning to regressive expectations about what it means to be a man or a woman, and if you don't play well with the gender norms of your society, well, then you have to be the other thing. Wrong and regressive and really bad, especially for women.
If without breaking your flow, I can add a point there. I'm getting something from what you're saying that I hadn't seen before, just game theoretically speaking. Mm-hmm. If we take a bunch of stuff and we say, hey, here's some guy stuff, and then here's girl stuff. And as you point out, in the 70s and 80s, you were free to do whichever of those things you really wanted to do, and it didn't cause anybody to question your sex, right?
Right.
If we now say, well, that's guy stuff, and we take every person who is born female and is doing some guy stuff and has guy-like instincts or whatever, and we say, oh, you know what that means? Guess you're a boy, right? And so we force some large fraction of those people to jump the gap into transition, whatever that is, leaving on the female side people who express these more traditionally female patterns. Then the point is actually somebody like you who encountered that world, if you arrive in that world after you've already done that, then the point is if you want to be out there playing rough and doing whatever, right, and you see that the only people who get to do that who are born female are people who are trans and go through some transition, then the point is that becomes like a, either you're going to have to go do a bunch of stuff that you didn't feel like doing in the first place, or transition is the alternative. It creates a false choice.
That's right. And it pushes you to thinking, well, the only reasonable option here is to declare myself trans because then I get access to the stuff. And there's something, and I'm talking about girls and women who come to believe that they are boys or men specifically, and which is not the sort of the predatory direction of the trans problem. The predatory direction is the other direction. But it's also true that in modern times, many people would have you believe that to be a woman is to, almost inherently end up being raped. And, the Me Too movement, which could have been amazing and was completely taken off the rails, suggests that, everything is bad for girls and women all the time. The workforce is, replete with sexism and groping and harassment, and you'll never get to the top, and women are paid less, and it's exhausting and terrifying and awful, and like, well, why don't I just become a man? Fuck's sake.
Right.
Like, why don't I just become a man? Okay, this is terrible, and also I don't even get to do the things I want to do if I know that I'm this, so I'll just do that. I'll just be that thing. And what isn't being said, I mean, a lot of us are saying it's like, actually, there's a whole lot of false narrative out here. You're being given a whole lot of false choices that you didn't have to make before, and the one that you're being pushed into is actually not an option. That's a failure to recognize basic reality. Like you cannot become a man if you were born female. You cannot.
You can't do it. You can't even have the thing, even if it's the thing that you want. You can do something, but it's not what you're being promised.
Right. And the people who I think privately, and I think they know that I think of them as, true trans, actually trans. I read them as, I engage them as the gender that they are living as, even though it is not the sex that they actually are. And they do not deny biological reality. The people who are actually truly struggling with a gender dysphoria and gender dysmorphia that is persistent and consistent and painful and awful for them, such that they really feel that they need to live as the thing that they are not, the sex that they are not, even though they cannot ever actually become the sex that they are not the ones on the streets doing the activism. That's not what is happening. So
I had something else I wanted to add. I'm imagining a scenario in which a girl like you were, in modern times. If we just sort of transport your situation into modern times, and a girl who is enjoying doing stuff that's traditionally boy stuff, reveals this, and then gets a reaction from the female role models in her world that is predicated on the nonsense narrative that's being pumped through the New York Times, Scientific American,
the Biden administration, in which those females who should say, what's the natural thing to do? The natural thing to do is to be supportive of this girl. Frankly, there may be a little good-natured chiding of the fact that you're a tomboy. I don't think that's even out of keeping. The fact that a girl is, hanging with the boys is something that is worthy of comment. It's interesting. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, this girl should be getting feedback from her female elders about what she's doing, what its implications are. Obviously, that's, if she's hanging out with the boys, there are probably some things she needs to know earlier than she might need to know them otherwise. And instead of that, I'm imagining that these female role models are suddenly going to have the sense of, okay, she's trans. What does that mean? Well, it means we're in danger of a suicide if we're not supportive, right? That is the trump card that is used to sell this whole thing. Yep.
So the point is, okay, nobody do anything dumb, all right? We are completely supportive of her transness. We are there for her 100%. And so now we need to broadcast that at her so that she understands we're there. We're going to get her through this. There's lots of help available, blah, 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 blah. And so the point is, the feedback that would ordinarily, under any normal circumstances, at the very least, even if the girl thought she was trans, be like, are you sure? Can we talk about this? Lots of people have the sense that they are one thing or another, and it, naturally goes away in most people. So can we just, slow down and figure out what it means?
Yeah.
But the
somehow we've experienced a reversal of the default assumption. And the default assumption isn't a mild default assumption. The default assumption, which is that you're the sex you are, that's the default assumption. And the very, very, very exceedingly rare thing, which is, okay, maybe you're intersex, extremely rare, or you are the sex you are, but maybe you really are going to be better off living life as the other thing. We know some of those people because we were teaching at extremely liberal college, right? At the point that this was becoming more of a thing. Most people probably would never meet someone unless they who was actually trans in the true way, unless they happen to live in a small population where there's a particular genetic thing going on, like, as I mentioned, this little village in the Dominican Republic. So the fact that high schools, right, one girl declares herself trans and suddenly all of her friends are trans, that's not trans. No, that's social contagion is what that is. That's like anorexia, and that's like cutting. And unfortunately, that's like suicide, right? Like those are the things that we see spreading contagiously through teen groups, especially female teen groups, male teen groups as well, but female teen groups. And when it's anorexia or other eating disorders or cutting or, God forbid, suicide, we don't encourage it, do we? No, we do not encourage it. That would be criminal, as so is the encouraging of this social contagion that is happening.
So I want to fill that in a little bit. One, the examples you mentioned are exactly what you're saying. Social contagion is the right version of the story. Mm-hmm. There is another version of the story in which the same pattern exists, but it's not inherently pathological.
Okay.
Right? So we see lots of trends. Trendiness is a thing, especially in the young, right? Whether it's a trend about, how you wear your hair.
Hem length.
Hem length.
Right.
Whether it's the style of music that you like or the style of dancing that you're doing, or, the expression, nobody says daddy-o anymore. So the point is...
I never knew anyone who did.
Right. No, we are too young for daddy-o to have been a thing. So it was always hilarious. It was always a go-to. But the point is, it is very natural for social experiments. In fact,
right.
This is sort of Dawkins' understanding of what memes are, is that they're these like flashes of something spreading horizontally across the population. And it can be very, terrible stuff like cutting or worse, or it can be benign stuff, right? Like the inflection of your voice or whatever. And so the point is that is a natural feature of that age. And we have taken something.
And let's talk a little bit about why.
Yeah, well, let's get there. But we have taken something in which the consequences could not possibly be more dire and long-term. Right? You are talking about committing this, a tattoo is bad enough, right? You get a tattoo of something you thought was cool when you were 15, and it's like, oh, God, do I have to live with that thing or get it removed, right? But we're talking...
Stakes are low.
Right. The tattoo stakes are low compared to, you know what? I think I might be trans, right? And then suddenly we're, permanently modifying you in a way that actually takes functional stuff and replaces it with, at best, a simulation that isn't functional, right? This is the whole...
Well, people are becoming living avatars.
That's it.
They are
the online rules.
They are aspiring to be a facade.
Yep.
To be an avatar that will pass. And especially the younger these kids do this, the more likely they are never to have experienced their body as an adult. The more likely they are never to have experienced sex with another human being. The more likely they are never to have experienced moving around the world and seeing how it is that the world engages with them as they are, as opposed to as they imagine they could be in their heads. And the idea that I know, as someone who has not yet even fully gone through puberty, that I need to be a thing which I have no empirical understanding of either being a man or a woman, because I'm too young to have experienced either yet, I'm going to block my ability permanently from becoming either. That's horrifying. Everyone is born, with very rare exceptions, everyone is born such that they will become a man if they were born a girl, or a woman. Did I just say that wrong? A man if they were born a boy, or a woman if they were born a girl. And if you were born a girl, you can't become a man. If you were born a boy, you can't become a woman. And if you wanted it differently, I'm sorry. Like that, you can't have everything you want. That's not reality. So by allowing children to block their puberty, even that is sufficient to, if they just stop it at that, if they're just on puberty blockers for a couple of years, and then something intervenes, they're like, yeah, actually, I'm not going to go on the cross-sex hormones, I'm not going to have the surgery, even just the puberty blockers will render them less completely what they would have been, absent that ceasing of development on some channels for some number of years. Because it doesn't just put you in stasis. We aren't metamorphic creatures in the same way that a butterfly is, but we are developing along all of the possible axes, along all the possible domains, especially throughout our adolescence. And puberty blockers slow down some of it, halt some of it, don't affect others of it. And at the point that you come off of it, if that's the only thing that you did, you might never obtain full fertility. You might never obtain your full form that you would have. You might not have the same voice that you would have. You might not have the same behaviors and brain that you would have. And furthermore, no one, including you, will ever know. So this is a series of experimental manipulations of humanity for which there is no possibility of a full understanding, because the intervention itself prevents there being a control.
So, which brings us back to the question of contagion being the pathological version or just horizontal transmission of culture in young people. And I think what I'm realizing is you wanted to come back to the question of why it is that things spread so readily, cultural traits spread so readily in young people, why we see that pattern. And I think actually this really gets at something new, which is there is a reason that trends spread in young people. And a lot of the trends that spread are nonsense, and they're triggered by, advertisers who are looking to manipulate the young into spending money. And so in some sense, I think we miss the importance of why it is that the young are so susceptible to patterns of behavior spreading horizontally, where that would be much less likely to be true in adults, although maybe more so.
Susceptible, a more apt word when it's pathological. Innovative, perhaps, when it's creating a new cultural way of being, and is, maybe this is where you're going, but is responsive to, actually, I don't live in the world that my parents did. Like the world is changing such that I, as an adolescent, need to look out into the world and say, this is my world to frame as I need to understand it. And what my parents are telling me, what my elders are telling me about what is right and good may not be the best way forward if the world isn't entirely static.
So there was a documentary, and unfortunately, because I didn't know we were going here, I don't remember the exact title. It was a PBS documentary called the Merchants of Cool or something like that. Of Cool was definitely in the title. Mm-hmm. And it was a group of advertising folks, especially some folks who looked much younger than they actually were, who were part of a project to figure out who the trendsetters were amongst these teenagers, and to figure out what it was they were doing that caused them to be able to set a trend. And then the advertisers picked up on it and they did that thing, right?
Yeah.
And essentially, the trendsetters were this will come as no surprise to anybody who was paying attention as they moved through that phase of life. The trendsetters are very often the people who are a bit insensitive to what people think of them. They do something and they don't really care. And the point is, oh, that is kind of cool. That's powerful that, you're going to dress in a way that if you described it to me, I might think was ridiculous, but you're sitting there in class and you don't even care. You don't care how people are looking at you. That speaks of power, right? Mm-hmm. And so we've got a bastardized version of this because advertisers have invaded every aspect of our lives. And so I think we're misled into feeling that this whole trend-making apparatus is all some kind of weird shenanigans. It's a con at some level, but that's not its inherent nature. Mm-hmm. And right. If you imagine a high school that exists, if you impose on it the structure of civilization that existed 300 years ago, right, where people didn't move very far from where they were born typically, mm-hmm. then the point is, why would you be susceptible to picking up a role that was catching on in your little social milieu as you were passing through that age? Well, in some sense, your cohort is about to emerge into adulthood and inherit the power to run the place over time. And you are establishing, everybody is picking a role, and that changes the roles available to everybody else. And so in some sense, being sensitive to, what's working? Well, if that's cool in your cohort, and your cohort's going to stick with that being cool, then it makes sense to be able to play in that milieu, right? So anyway, I think in some ways, this doesn't make any sense in a giant anonymous high school where you're going to leave and never see most of these people again. But the idea that you should be very sensitive to, as you point out, you're not going to live in your parents' world. You're going to live in a new world. And in that world, there will be rules, and you're discovering them as they form amongst these people who don't yet have power but are about to, that it makes sense to jockey for where am I going to be? Who am I in that world? Mm-hmm. And so the point is, you want a world. It is natural for human beings to experiment at that phase of life for reasons that may not make any sense anymore, but are nonetheless deeply built in. The last thing that you want to do is sit there at the edge of the playground and look for one pattern that you're going to decide is unlike all of the other trends you're going to ignore and say, that one's medical. Mm-hmm. That's deep psychological stuff. We now have absolute evidence. This is a special kind of human being that requires severe medical intervention that will permanently alter who this person is into the future. The point is, no. That's like saying, okay, you go get a haircut and it's wild and people are actually kind of cool with it. And you're like, okay, that's your haircut for life. Right? If it was a haircut, that would be bad enough. If you were stuck with something that, right? Bad enough. But now we're talking about actually interfering with the opportunities that the person will have physiologically going forward. That couldn't be crazier.